Yeah. Okay. Let's thanks everybody for coming. Please ignore all this stuff that I'm wasting your time with. We'll go ahead and get to the main event here. Welcome to Delivery Exception, Supply Chain Justice and Reconciliation. We'll go ahead and get started. Delivery Exception is a speaker series which is organized as part of the Supply Studies Research Network, bringing together scholars and organizers to discuss logistical justice and examine the possibilities of reconciliation in an era of supply chain capitalism. This event is sponsored in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Office of Digital Humanities, the Conference of Arts and Science Deans, and the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Fordham. I have some additional credits. Obviously, as a virtual event, the geographies that we are gathering here are many, but Fordham itself occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger people. So I want to give that land acknowledgement here, along with these money credits, I suppose. I also want to let you know about our last event coming up next week, Wednesday, March 27th at 6 p.m. We have an event with Benjamin McKean, Jessica Champagne, and Hellas Solis, and Evangelina Aguerta, which is, I think, titled 25 Years of Supply Chain Solidarity. I'll be posting some information about it shortly, but it's a large number of people. It's going to be a fun and exciting event, and I hope that some of you who are here today are able to join for that. And I think we're just working out the details right now, but I think this will also be available in Spanish if that's your preferred language to listen in. So that will be an exciting event. So our speaker today is going to be presenting Seeing Like a Supply Chain. Miriam Posner is an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles' Department of Information Studies. She's also a digital humanities scholar with interests in labor, race, feminism, and the history and philosophy of data. Her PhD in film studies and American studies is from Yale University. She has published widely on technology, data, and the humanities, including some really excellent pieces in Logic, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. She is currently a fellow at the National Humanities Center, where she's working on a very exciting book about the technology of global supply chains under contract with Yale University Press. So please, we'll go ahead and welcome Miriam. If you have any questions at any time, there'll be some time at the end. You can put those questions as we go into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to address them after Miriam talks for a little while. Thanks so much. And Miriam, whenever you'd like to begin.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. I'm just gonna see if I can share my screen here. Okay. And thanks to all of you for spending time here with me this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I know it's not an easy thing to take time out of everything else you're doing to listen to someone else talk. So I really appreciate you doing it. And I am excited for the next event in this series. It sounds so exciting. I also wanted to thank Matt for being such an excellent touchstone for everybody who's working on critical logistics. Like, how lucky are we that someone like Matt is here to bring us all together all the time. So probably people here know about Matt's website, supplystudies.com, but if you're interested in supply chains and you haven't seen it, I mean, it's just an incredible wealth of materials. So having said that, I will jump in. So I remember vividly the early days of the COVID pandemic, and I'm sure you do too, and how disorienting it was to see empty grocery store shelves and long lines at the checkout counter. Because at least since FDR made freedom from want a cornerstone of his For Freedom speech, consumer goods in abundance have been part of what Americans could expect from life in this nation. That's part of the deal. We may not have much of a social safety net, but the shelves of stores will always be full to bursting for the benefit of anyone with the cash. So, to me, there was something intensely destabilizing about these widespread consumer shortages in the spring of 2020. And I was as freaked out as anyone, but I think part of me knew that I shouldn't have been surprised because for years I'd been investigating the operation of global supply chains. And I'd learned that they are both more complex and more precarious than most people would ever suspect. I got interested in this project when I was teaching a class on digital labor at UCLA, an embarrassingly long time ago. And like everyone, I knew that supply chains were a big part of the story of what it means to live and work in the digital age. And so I thought perhaps I could ask my students to trace the supply chain of an electronic device. But luckily, I had the sense to try this myself first, because I quickly learned that the assignment was close to impossible. Not just because companies want to keep their supply chain secret, but because most of them actually have no idea where their products come from. The truth is much more fragmented and chaotic. As one supply chain veteran intoned at an industry conference I attended, the dirty secret of supply chains is that no one ever knows where the hell anything is. So how is this possible? Well, it is like this. The term chain is really a misnomer. It's more accurate to think of supply lines as a kind of web or a tree-shaped network. So imagine in the image on the slide that the tree has been sort of tipped over so that it's lying on the ground. At the top is the lead or the tier 1 firm. It's marked a buyer on this image, the one whose name is on the box. And beneath that firm are these tiers and tiers of contractors and subcontractors, each node cascading downward into a net of its own sub-vendors. So when one supplier drops out of the web, let's say there's a strike or a natural disaster, a replacement can slot into its place without anyone except its neighboring nodes being any the wiser. So there's no central watchtower overseeing anyone's global supply chain, for the most part. There's some exceptions that are interesting, but for the most part, there is none. Under normal circumstances, lead corporations can stay out of the fray, counting on supply networks to more or less heal themselves. The power and capital differential between companies in the global north and the global south means that these lead corporations can set the terms, and subcontractors often have no choice but to comply. And that's also why companies like Lululemon or Amazon, any number of examples, can credibly claim shock at the discovery of labor abuses within their supply chains. They're not actually lying, I don't think. They genuinely don't know what's going on in their supply networks because the system was designed that way. So anytime you see an article about abuse being uncovered in a supply chain, it's sort of a game with me to see how long it takes before the company says that they had no idea. And the system actually works most of the time. That's one of the weirdest things about the global supply network. Most companies have no idea who made the basic components of their products, but I can still tell you down to the hour when the bath towels I ordered on Amazon will arrive at my door. So we're used to being able to procure pretty much anything we want whenever we want it. But while the global supply network can easily absorb isolated crises and shutdowns, a global scale crisis is beyond its capabilities, as we saw during the first few months of the COVID pandemic. So the book that I've been working on is about how we got here and then what might be up ahead. And in order to figure this out, I have talked to anyone in the industry willing to sit down for an interview. I've read textbooks from the 50s about traffic management and got deep into the arcana of maritime finance. And every time I think I've figured things out, I discover a new aspect of the field that I hadn't realized exists. But slowly, very slowly, the outlines of the SCM approach to logistics have emerged from this chaos of vendors, hype, and technology. So today I wanted to talk about where this SCM approach to moving goods comes from. What are SCM's ground level assumptions, those ideas about the world that inform its rules of operation? As scholars of infrastructure have pointed out, systems we rely on, like the global supply chain, have a way of seeming inevitable, but actually they're the product of specific political and ideological conditions. In the words of the media theorist Luke Munn, infrastructures, quote, accomplish a double move, not only advancing a certain epistemic mode, but also crowding out competing models of cognition. So let's talk about what epistemic mode contemporary SCM instantiates, and then maybe we can think about what the mode crowds out. So there is a famous story, or famous to some people, very few people probably, about Norbert Wiener, the celebrated engineer. This was during World War II, and Wiener was convinced that he had a better way to target enemy aircraft. The issue was, when you see an airplane traveling through space, a certain amount of time elapses between spotting the aircraft and hitting it with a missile. Like you aim your missile and shoot it, but by the time the missile reaches where the aircraft is supposed to be, it'll have moved. So Wiener solved the first part of the problem without too much trouble. He used predictive algorithms to predict the likely trajectory of a plane as it moved through space, like assuming its trajectory was constant. But the other problem was, plane's movement doesn't always stay constant. A pilot might take steps to avoid the missile. Norbert Wiener's idea was that pilots would select evasive maneuvers from a limited repertoire of possibilities, like bank left or bank right, or go up. I'm not sure what else a pilot does, presumably something. And by creating a database of these movements and correlating them with real historical data, gunners, Wiener thought, could actually predict the most likely course of action of any individual aircraft, thus targeting the exact place the plane was most likely to be at the moment a missile passed through it. Unfortunately for him, nobody seemed to like this idea. Wiener was more or less told to drop it, his plan dismissed as too complicated and time-consuming. So no one ever built Wiener's ideal anti-aircraft gun. But the plan didn't go away. Instead, it became a founding document of a field that would come to be called cybernetics, and Wiener was hailed as prescient. 52 years later, two business school professors returned to this topic of airplanes, this time in an article for the Harvard Business Review called Managing by Wire. Explaining that managing by wire refers to the task of operating an aircraft via instruments alone, the authors argued that the goal of today's managers should be to perform a similar feat. They should build a world made out of data and determine the best course of action by modeling predictions and running alternative scenarios. So, the idea was sometimes pilots can't actually see the world, so they use their instruments to fly, and that's called managing by wire. And so executives should do something similar, but with a world made out of data. With an organization that was properly networked and with enough compatible data, executives could make decisions far faster and execute them more efficiently than any human on his own. And once a corporation is modeled properly, they claimed, the map becomes the terrain. In other words, it becomes real in cyberspace. The executive crew then pilots the organization using controls in the information cockpit of the business. They may not have been aware of it, But these business school professors were continuing a trajectory articulated by Norbert Wiener and his cadre of like-minded thinkers. The principles laid out by engineers like Wiener made their way deeply into management literature and training, and over the course of the 20th century, became integrated into the architecture of business software itself. Nobody really talks about cybernetics anymore. Nobody normal. Academics talk about it a lot, but normal people usually don't. But that's not because it's disappeared. Instead, as I'll explain, its logic became so ubiquitous as to hardly need a name. So in this talk, I wanted to talk about how and why that happened, and perhaps more importantly, some implications of this view of the world, focusing specifically on the way that organizations envision and configure their supply chains. So in the decades after World War II, Wiener and his like-minded colleagues attempted to show that any phenomenon could be modeled as a system, and that all systems consist of moving signals, just like an electrical circuit. And depending on who you talk to, they called this doctrine cybernetics, operations research, games theory, systems analysis. There are differences among these sort of subdisciplines, but the historian Peter Gallison calls all of these fields the Manichaean sciences, philosophies of, quote, control mechanisms in which the exchange of information would play a central role. And if it worked for enemy aircraft, why not for other domains? Analysts in this new field of cybernetics thought that it could. So they drew up models of interactive systems for biology, nuclear deterrence, management, and as they grew in confidence, to human communication and interaction. The trick was to conceive of every actor as a node within a system and to anticipate all the variables in behavior in a limited taxonomy, just like Wiener did with the enemy aircraft. Now, why might a node behave as it did? Who knows? And really, who cares? That's outside the remit of the cybernetic worldview. Instead, each node is conceived as a black box, a basically inscrutable entity that simply communicates and receives signals. What happens inside is not our concern. All that matters is the signal communicated out to the larger network, just the way an electrical pulse moves around a circuit. With the right feedback mechanisms, these systems could even self-correct. So they thought, without any human intervention, in the same way, for example, that the human body regulates its own temperature. Over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, during the entire course of the Cold War, these systems analysts fanned out across the globe, bringing the gospel of cybernetics to management consultancies, governments, and think tanks. Wherever they went, they encouraged organizations to decentralize and optimize, to reconceive themselves as networks of information sensing, self-governing nodes. Now, one area that was ripe for optimization was the heretofore unglamorous arm of industry called physical distribution, whose practitioners seemed hopelessly mired in the arcana of train schedules, import taxes, and personal relationships. But with the help of this new breed of systems consultant, distribution adopted the new military-inflected name of logistics, and with it the sheen of a cutting-edge, highly technical science. Over time, management thinking coalesced around the idea of treating large corporations not as a collection of separate functional units, but as one united organization, kind of like a giant organism that could mobilize its resources as it moved toward a singular goal. But at the same time, the supply chain itself became estranged from the organization. Globalization and outsourcing refigured manufacturing from an internal process for which a company is responsible to a pre-existing external system with which a company interacts. In order to respond to threats and challenges, an organism needs a nervous system. And for a corporation, that system is composed of information technology. The task of coordinating a business's information proceeded in fits and starts, from ledgers to pigeonholes to file cabinets, and by the post-war period, to hulking mainframe computers. And these machines were at first confined to running complex calculations for specialists, but by the 1960s, technologists argued that they could use computers to predict purchasing needs in line with demand fluctuations. They called these manufacturing control systems MRPs, which stood for Material Requirements Planning. But over time, the name changed as the remit of these software packages expanded to cover more and more parts of the organization. By the time the Harvard professors wrote about managing by wire in the 1990s, the modern name for this software architecture was an ERP, or Enterprise Resource Planning System. And you know these systems even if you don't think you do. The brand names include SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft Dynamics, and their remit now includes the management of HR, accounting, marketing, and of course, supply chain management. In technicians' dream scenario, these systems harvest and harmonize data from every corner of the organization, conveying and responding to information about the market in the same way that your nervous system transmits messages from your fingertips. These systems, in theory, also learn from the past, using machine learning to incorporate data about historical prices and performance into their existing models of the corporation and its environment. So to help us understand how these systems work, let's look at SAP SCM, the supply chain management software with the largest market share. You may not have personally interacted with SAP, or maybe you have. UCLA uses SAP, but it's everywhere, one of the biggest software companies in the world.
SAP, the world leader in business software. SAP is a part of almost everything you do, from your alarm clock to your breakfast cereal, your computer. Even your car was most likely produced by organizations with SAP at the heart of their processes.
My name is Brian Swankeson. I'm the Vice President of Enterprise Solutions for PepsiCo.
Jennifer Saran, and I am the Corporate Treasurer of eBay.
Ryan Hannawalt, I'm the Manager of Finance for CKE Restaurants.
Bobby Joseph, I'm Senior Manager with Baker Hughes.
Head of Information and Integration Architecture at Centrica.
I'm a Global Supply Chain Manager at Steelcase.
And I run SAP.
And I run SAP.
And I run SAP.
And PepsiCo runs SAP.
So lots of companies run SAP, as it turns out. All right, I don't want to subject you to that again. So SAP actually consists of several large suites of tools, which are further subdivided into modules and then into individual functions, which SAP calls transactions. And if you've used something like Microsoft Access or FileMaker, SAP's interface, or at least the version I use, which is a little out of date, looks a little bit like that. So not a lot of attention being paid to slick interfaces. Because of the complexity of the system, SAP specialists usually wield expertise in only one of the components. So an SCM specialist, for example, will usually pass the baton to a database specialist if a need emerges to modify the system's master data. Before she begins planning a supply chain manager will generally receive a forecast from a demand planner who specializes in analyzing trends and market conditions in order to predict future demand. The supply chain manager then works backwards from these predictions, lining up factories and ordering raw materials in order to make sure the right quantities of goods are available at the right times. SAP's SCM module comes with built-in optimizers, which use machine learning algorithms to quickly sort through costs for storage, transport, and procurement in order to schedule the most cost-effective means of producing and delivering goods. So that's what you're seeing in the image on this slide. I'm running an optimizing algorithm. SAP SCM can even work out the most cost-effective way to load goods into a container or truck bed so that shipping containers are filled to the brim. Once the production plan is complete, it's transmitted to production managers who can use it to schedule workers in a company's own factories or set the timing and terms for subcontractors. So in my reading, SAP SCM is an object lesson in how information can travel seamlessly through an organization, while simultaneously no one in the network possesses a full view of the system in its entirety. Data is black boxed at every handover point, meaning the output is available, but the process through which that data was produced is impossible to know. Supply chain managers are indeed managing by wire, but there's no one in particular sitting in the cockpit. The system has its own logic, with each component fine-tuned to move toward the goal of profitability. In the last couple of decades, the pace of these information circuits has increased enormously as machine learning and artificial intelligence have become integrated into the management of supply chains. You saw machine learning at work already in the optimization button of the SAP software. Behind the scenes, the software is iterating through millions of scenarios until it finds the combination of time and resources that results in the most efficient solutions. At management schools, supply chain scholars devise even more creative algorithms for supply chain management. Some of these methods do things like seek to minimize risk by assigning scores to geographical locations and combining this data with historical information, using neural networking techniques to arrive at the least risky method of hopscotching goods across the globe. Some of these methods make use of what are called digital twins, informational models of corporations with which technicians can run infinite combinations of business scenarios against infinite changes in the global environment. So realizing the dream of managing by wire. And as we speak, cargo ships are running algorithms devised by Google and Microsoft as they seek the most efficient path and pace to their destinations. So in my argument, with these calculative devices, companies have attempted to resolve a contradiction that bedevils the discipline of supply chain management. The competing drives for more information on the one hand, and the need to disclaim responsibility for material conditions on the other. It turns out that artificial intelligence is an ingenious solution to this problem because by definition, the interior workings of a machine learning algorithm are incomprehensible to a human being. Recently, the US government has required importers to certify that their products are not manufactured by forced Uyghur labor. This poses a problem for many corporations, which of course have no idea where or how their products are manufactured. So at one SCM conference, I was fascinated to see a vendor who proposed to use artificial intelligence to give companies its best guess at their own supply chains. Translating forced labor into shades of probabilities seems to me an ingenious way to combine a ravenous need for information with an equally urgent need to avoid responsibility for conditions as they actually exist. So these characteristics of cybernetic systems are actually well known, as numerous theorists have investigated the cybernetic architecture of so many of our decision-making apparatus. In these systems, theorists tell us, the material world is refigured as computable information, meaning all material conditions must be interpreted such that only those features that are compatible with the model can be recorded. Like you can't compute a banana, you need to transform it into a digital banana. This process of computability requires input to be divided and categorized because information only can acquire meaning when it is discrete and interchangeable. Once it has digested information in this way, a cybernetic system optimizes and reconfigures so that the entire entity, like Norbert Wiener's ballistic missiles, moves forward as one toward its goal. Now, the insidiousness of the cybernetic metaphor, the theorist Seb Franklin tells us, is that it absorbs everything it touches. And once you're in it, it can be very hard to find a way out. If the basis of every decision is a rational calculation, one must, by definition, be acting irrationally if one objects to the system. And because the cybernetic system is supremely flexible and adaptive, it can seem very difficult to thwart. Over time, as a result of competition, the pressure builds on every system to become more efficient, to eliminate any latency in the network. Workers in the cybernetic organization feel the absence of slack via the elimination of breaks, an increase in hours, and dwindling benefits. Pointing to Norbert Wiener's anti-aircraft computer, the historian Peter Gallison argues that cybernetic sciences encourage us to see every other actor as an antagonist, what Gallison calls, quote, a particular kind of enemy. On the mechanized battlefield, the enemy is neither invisible nor irrational. And here when we say enemy, we're talking about the supply chain. This was an enemy at home in the world of strategy, tactics, and maneuver, all the while thoroughly inaccessible to us, separated by a gulf of distance, speed, and metal. It was a vision in which the enemy pilot was so merged with machinery that his human, non-human status was blurred. Logistics, in my reading, is the attempt to absorb the globe into the apparatus of the machine. And over the course of globalization, the cybernetic corporation has demonstrated its extraordinary ability to absorb and integrate diverse people and places. The theorists Fred Moten and Stefano Harney write, this is not making the road as we walk in the anarchist tradition. This is converting everything in its path into a coordinated time and space for ownership. As Moten and Harney argue, and as Christina Sharp elaborates, the slave ship is the defining emblem of the logistics drive to extract and absorb the material of the world into the calculative rationality of profit. Such seizing, such grasping, and such loss prevention is the mode of operation for the wickedness of the Atlantic slave trade, the first massive, diabolic commercial logistics, write Moten and Harney. Sharp uses the tragedy of the Zong to illustrate the calculative basis of the slave trade. In 1781, 133 enslaved men, women, and children were thrown overboard from the Zong to perish in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship's crew had made a calculation about their cargo's value and determined that because of specific clauses in the ship's insurance, the passengers were worth more to the ship owner dead than alive. And it's this clockwork madness that the poet Norbese Philip dissects in her poem Zong, in which she rips apart and reassembles the Zong's insurance policy in order to reclaim the passengers from the calculative rationality that took their lives. The translation of a human being into a predictable value, and thus a unit that can be circulated and traded, depends upon the classification of that human being into a particular category and then assigning that category a lower value. In other words, to make it data. So this is the metamorphosis that took place even before the slaves were forced onto the Zong, that of the particular body into one of a range of computable values on the actuarial spreadsheet. And we can see that same logic at work today in the contemporary crisis of abandoned seafarers. When a ship's debt are worth more than the ship itself, ship owners have increasingly opted to simply stop paying crew members' wages and abandon the ship where it is. In 2021, at least 91 ships were abandoned by their owners, their crew members still aboard. These instances of abandonment, cruel though they may be, are simple calculations on the owner's part. When value X exceeds value Y, perform action Z. Now, the pandemic might have been an occasion for us to question the wisdom of relegating global supply chains to the realm of the algorithmic unknowable, but instead the logistics industry doubled down on this vision. The problem wasn't that we view supply chains as inhuman. The problem was that they still featured too many humans in all their illogic and fallibility. And one way that has manifested is in an arms race to build the first cargo ship capable of piloting itself across the ocean. These designs for the ships make them look more like bullets or missiles than the vessels that we're used to, since without a crew, these ships can jettison the sleeping quarters and mess halls necessary for human habitation. In the future, shipping companies imagine, one captain could oversee a whole fleet of vessels, which ply the seas mostly unattended, something like enormous Roombas. So this is not a real scenario that you were watching, but it is a very fascinating rendering of what Kongsberg Maritime hopes to see. We're also seeing a gold rush of another sort as banks and corporations vie for control over the $5 trillion trade finance market. Trade finance is the way companies pay for the production of goods before they've actually received payment from the eventual buyers. Right now, trade finance is a mess of documents, emails, and phone calls. But if this system can be digitized and maybe even automated with smart contracts, we can imagine a future in which commodities change hands, perhaps even destinations, algorithmically via self-driving ships stitched into the value calculations of financial markets. So all these possibilities herald a glimmering automated future, a streamlined world unbroken by the needs of regular human beings. And yet, if the pandemic taught us one thing, it's that, like it or not, we're linked to each other all across the globe because of our shared and apparently intractable humanity. After all, one way to see the empty supermarket shelves is that infrastructure broke down and the network temporarily crashed. But another way to see those missing products is that human beings got sick and died. There are so many ways to fine-tune the global supply network. You can perfect feedback mechanisms, optimize signal flow, and react to information with incredible speed. AI techniques promise to route trade around disasters faster than ever before. Supply chains accomplish extraordinary feats, rearranging space and time to deliver us virtually anything at any time. Their existence is a testament to human ingenuity. But in order to accomplish these feats, they need to remake the world in their own image. The map becomes the terrain, to quote the Harvard management professors. And IT becomes, to quote them again, the tendons that hold the skeleton and muscles of the company together. Now, in reality, of course, the map doesn't become the terrain. Life in its complexity continues to thwart and elude the machinery of the global supply chain. But in order to most effectively evade its capture, I think it's valuable to understand the world that the supply chain wants to build. Thank you. And I am very happy to take questions, should you have them.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that amazing talk. Let me give you a virtual clap, as many other people are doing.
Virtual clap to you all for sitting through it.
Virtual claps. So yeah, we do have plenty of time for some questions, and I see one from Ezra, which I'll read. But if you have a question, you can go ahead and either type it into the chat, and I'm happy to read it out, or you can raise your virtual hands, and I can give you permission to ask your question through your microphone if you'd like to do that. So I'll read Ezra's, and then we'll go to Elizabeth Schwartz. Ezra says, I'm interested in discussing the way this lack of responsibility Miriam is summarizing for the overall design of the SAP system, where no one is aware of every mechanism and therefore cannot be held accountable for it. Was it intentional, and at what scale? How many layers of technical design decisions allowed this? Over how many years in companies and countries? Are AI logistics in many ways simply the latest iteration of unopenable black boxes in a long line of other mechanisms that obscure responsibility? And we have a reference to sabotage, the hidden nature of finance, and the argument that profit comes primarily from evading market regulation systems via sabotaging accountability mechanisms. Is that roughly what's visible in SAP's architecture?
Yes, what an astute question. There's a few parts to it, but you're getting at some of the very things that like I'm really interested in and thinking about right now, Ezra. So let's see. Well, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is something called the beer game. Has anyone ever played the beer game? Or maybe if you've been to business school, you might have done something like this. So it's purportedly the work of Jay Forrester, who devised one of these Manichaean sciences called systems theory. And the idea is like everybody in the class is assigned to play one part of a beer corporation. Like one group is the distributor, one group is the manufacturer, one group is, God, what else? I don't know, HR. And their job is to like receive demand signals from the professor and then try to coordinate their operations so that the entire system works well. And the problem is when every group tries to optimize what it does, the entire system ends up in a big mess because no one is thinking about like what the system as a whole should be doing. Like the manufacturers try to make as much beer as they can, as fast as they can. But what they don't think about is how that overwhelms the distributor who has nowhere to put the beer. So this was like a big kind of invention for business schools, this way of looking at a corporation as a system. And it's a very cybernetic way of thinking about the way a corporation works. And it became part of the kind of management curriculum at many schools, part of the way people think about business. And I kept thinking about the beer game and thinking something is weird about that. And then I realized that no one in the beer game is able to see what's happening in its entirety because every node within the beer game receives information, like in the form of demand signals. And then when the organization is working well, they'll then modify that information according to an algorithm and then modify the beer, for example, that they manufacture as a result. So because these nodes are each like operating as a little, like a servo mechanism, regulating themselves, no one is seeing the entire thing. So and that's in fact the way that in my reading, a lot of the software, overseeing corporations was also developed. So no one said at any point, like, let's make like an evil system. I know you weren't proposing that they were, but nobody had to. They were just thinking, how can we make a system that operates as smoothly as possible, given what we know about how systems work? The problem was there are some like weird implications to that, as we've discovered many years down the line. And yes, you are very prescient to see that connection to AI because, in that description of a cybernetic system, those of you who have like worked with something like a neural net may have seen some resemblances. And in fact, cybernetics anticipated many of the moves that AI researchers made in developing things like neural nets. I have not read the book that you mentioned, but I'm putting it on my list right now because it sounds really interesting. And anti-panopticon. Oh, I love that. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, for at least in the past, you can actually order a copy of the beer game from the System Dynamics Society. I don't know if they
I gotta
still
get one.
offer that. Miriam and I were talking about like feelies a little bit, stuff, you have books and things before this, and I do have a copy of which I bought stupidly because I just wanted to have it up in the closet. I'll also say to Ezra's question, one of the things in my work that is interesting, which feeds on Miriam's statement that people aren't necessarily designing these systems in this intentionally malicious way, is that some of the really early computerization stuff seems very accidental, like the splitting up of the bill of materials into smaller and smaller subcomponents. Joseph Orlicki writes that that was partly a function of the available memory for computers at that time. So it wasn't necessarily that they were designing a global supply chain where a screw is made over here and this other piece is made over here. That's just kind of an accidental almost outcome of it. But Elizabeth Schwartz, I've given you permission to talk, so feel free to ask your question.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming, Miriam. This is so exciting. I read a bunch of your stuff in the iSchool at the University of Illinois.
Wow, I'm honored.
Well, Zoe LeBlanc was my professor, and so she just rants and raves about you. So anyway, I was slightly late because hilariously, I've been working with a bunch of mask blocks across the US, which is basically organizations that hand out free masks to our community members, trying desperately to get 500,000 masks out of this warehouse in Winchester, Virginia. And I'm just sitting here wondering, like, as you were saying this, part of me is like allured by the idea of SAP and the sort of like ways in which that can optimize, the number of masks we can buy and get them to as many community members as possible.
Right?
Obviously, can't afford that. And so I guess part of my question is just like, what does a sort of like, what does a form of resistance to supply chain capitalism look like while working within it when our resources are tied to it and our communities do need those?
Yes, what a great question that like really gets at like the difficult part of this problem, and something I've been really wrestling with, because in some ways like it's amazing that we can hand out stuff efficiently. It's unfortunate that we do it according to the economic model that we use, but it is like a huge feat. So you may have seen that next week a group is coming to talk about their own. Sorry, tell me, I just don't want to get the names wrong. Matt, who is it? I know Ben McKean is coming, and then
yes, it's Ben McKean, Jessica Champagne, and Hella Solis, and Evangelina. I don't have Evangelina's last name here, but
come next
yes.
week and find out, because I think in a lot of ways it's like the workers who I trust the most to give us information about this, but I'll also say that one thing that workers have noticed is that when things are operating according to like a to a kind of circuit, there are choke points. There's even a book called Choke Points about things like ports, the Red Sea, ports and canals. Thank you, Matt. Choke points that really are like the biggest constraints on the system. And we've seen how one ship stuck in the Panama Canal can like put the system at a standstill for weeks at a time. So, in the literature that I've been reading from scholars of this kind of thing, one of the things that's been most interesting to me has been investigations of like looking at how how workers at ports and canals and other choke points might kind of join up together. Matt, what do you think? Can I ask?
You can ask. I will defer an answer here because
I know, it's a tough one.
what is the most sort of effective politics of the future is why we're having this series, and I don't necessarily know the best answer. I mean, I think you're looking to what giving workers information to understand their power or where they can be powerful, choke points, things like that, I think is very interesting. I think Elizabeth's question about how do you work outside of SAP when it's I guess the master's tools, right? SAP is what enables supply chain capitalism or systems like that, right? And then what do we do if we want to do things like distribute masks or our own sort of not necessarily anti-capitalist, but maybe a capitalist kind of endeavors, right? We can't afford SAP. I mean, you've Miriam, written about SAP and how you had to take a course to sort of get exposed to it. I mean, it's not just something that we can just download and install, even as critical scholars wanting to look at these systems. And so it's really an awkward position where there's this like infrastructure of global supply chain software that we just don't really have access to, and which no one has access to, right? As you mentioned in your talk, even people who are using these systems, they only get that window, right? Their particular viewpoint. I mean, Fordham uses like Concur for when we submit receipts, and that's theoretically an SAP product, but I don't see what happens after I submit a reimbursement. It's someone else's job to look at that, and that's just how those systems are designed, as you point out.
Yeah. Well, I got to think of something, because wouldn't you be annoyed if you like finished the whole book and I didn't have any suggestions?
Yes,
So, let me know if you figured it out.
The unsatisfying suggestion that, well, I don't know what to do now after the book is, I live in fear of that also. But
I know, it's a tough one.
Yeah, actually, if other people have questions, please raise your hand, type them in the
Ezra
chat. But
pointed to Eden Medina's book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries, about the Chilean alternative planned cybernetic economy. And I've been reading about Stafford Beer, who helped build that system. What a weirdo! What a weird guy. So read it, Eden Medina's book, so you can find out more about Stafford Beer. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for the question, and thank you for doing that work. It's so important and awesome.
Yeah, I have a question, but I guess I will say there have been a number of small kind of like, how could we imagine alternative distribution networks, projects, usually art projects, right? They're usually kind of are framed as art projects. I think the one that is most familiar to me is Kate Rich's Feral Trade project. It's feraltrade.org. Obviously, that's a play on fair trade, which is kind of like a guerrilla distribution network. Basically people are like, oh, I'm flying to London, I could take this over. There's, I suppose, a slippery slope when you start talking about this. I don't know, do drug traffickers use SAP is an interesting question that, maybe someone out there has answers to. But my question is also about SAP. And while I'm asking this, if other people have questions, please type them in the chat, raise your hands. And I guess, to sort of punt on the politics for a second and go back to, where do you see as the most kind of critical turning point? The political solution is not necessarily rewind, because that's very difficult. But if we were to imagine a rewind, where does it go to? I came across some time ago this article that appeared in 1997 in the Wall Street Journal talking about SAP. It was called, maybe you've read it, it's called Program of Pain. They describe SAP, they say this is, quote, the corporate equivalent of a root canal. And at the time this article was written, they mention a couple big companies. They say Microsoft is using SAP, Coca-Cola wants it, but is not using it. Owens Corning has been installing it for 2 years, so since 1995, at the cost of about $100 million. And General Motors is thinking about getting it and could spend 10 times that much. So, just to pick an arbitrary time here, 1997 is a time where SAP is not yet the thing that every big company uses, which is the way it is today. Is that the place, or do we have to go back, to sort of the immediate aftermath of post-World War II, to, this early kind of cybernetic thinking and system dynamics and stuff like that? Where would you draw the kind of most critical inflection point, or maybe there are just too many to pick a most critical one?
Oh, that's so tough because like you've shown, in your dissertation that like a lot of these ways of thinking about goods and communication go back, to the 19th century, if not earlier. So, trying to remember the name of the book. I can never remember the book when I'm Ian Baucham's book. God, give me one sec. I know you guys can Google it just as well as I can, but Spectres of the Atlantic is I think in a way like one answer to that question. So it's about the Zong, not as like the origin moment of the transformation of people into data, but as kind of the emblematic moment of like the beginning of modern capitalism. So that would be one way to, I think, to answer that question. I've been thinking a lot about like the moment we exploded the bomb, when we exploded the bill of materials, as like one of those really important origin moments in the story of supply chain software, because it's true that like there were alternatives to SAP, but they worked based on Copics, so it's not as though there was like a radical alternative, at least not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
We should make our own Oppenheimer equivalent movie here, right? Exploding the bomb.
I know people would
bill
line
of
up.
materials. Yeah, it's
exploding the bomb.
When you first said that, I was like, oh, she's talking about nuclear weapon. Oh, no, wait, she means the bill of materials. Yeah. So
yes, but they're, it's all connected.
Yes. Any other questions? I have one more. Oh wait, we got a question here from Ben McKean. Thanks for the great talk. Longtime reader, first time caller. I'm trying to formulate a question about the powerful and surprising way the talk moves to chattel slavery as an archetype or endpoint of calculation and commodity chains, and how that stands in relation to the supply chain's reliance on discourses of cybernetics. The quantification, dehumanization, and instrumentalization of labor strikes me as characteristic of capitalist practices more generally. Yeah, what, if anything, do you think is characteristic about the form of abstraction in supply chain logic? And I'll pause there because I feel like that's a good, you can all read the rest of the question, but I feel like that is the question.
It's a really good, challenging question, I think. And another one that I've been considering myself. I guess there are different ways to answer that. I guess my first response is that it doesn't seem to me that like capitalism existed before cybernetics, and like there were, of course, and there were like elements of the cybernetic worldview that pre-existed cybernetics. So it's not as though capitalism needs cybernetics to function, but I do feel like cybernetics gave engineers and business strategists like the language and the epistemology they needed to like justify, or not even justify, but imagine no alternative to moving faster and faster through the circuit. So it was in my reading, an excellent way to frame some of the speed ups that we saw in the last half century, 70 years. How is seeing like a supply chain different from seeing like a capitalist? My impulse is to point to Anna Tsing's essay about supply chains, which is super useful because she argues that like we're living in the supply chain, the era of supply chain capitalism, which is a certain kind of capitalism in which like the world is organized such that there are like lead companies that are able to kind of steer the movements of entire countries in the global South. So I guess I'll punt to Anna Tsing on that, with the disclaimer that I'm still thinking it through.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think that, those of us who are interested in the history of supply chains, I think this is one of the things that we are very interested in doing is finding all these different little moments where capitalism changed in subtle ways, maybe, or
Yeah.
ways that were not necessarily, immediately recognized. Hello, Nikki. Daddy's on a Zoom call.
Oh, say hi. Say hi.
And I got the food and sauce.
Okay, why don't you go eat the food? Do you want to say hi to everybody for a second?
Yeah,
No, you have to go downstairs.
understandable.
All right. Let me ask a question to Miriam, and then I'll hang out with you for a second. Sorry, everybody. This is the realities of Zooming at home. But when you were talking about AI, Miriam, every time I feel like, I hear you talk, because I lived so much maybe in the past, thinking about this AI future where AI is the tool for enabling, that sort of that lack of accountability is really kind of terrifying, and not something I guess I had thought about quite in the way that you presented it, where it's like when Google came with all the algorithms. I remember like when Gmail rolled out and people were like, oh, it's going to search through my email, and Google was like, well, don't worry, it's the algorithm doing it, no human is going to see that. And that was a way of kind of shifting that responsibility. And now it's an even more complex algorithm that people can't even really tell you exactly how it works, is going to be optimizing your supply chain. So in some sense, if it optimizes a little forced labor here or there, it's not like you did it, right? The AI system, it was a flaw in how the AI was programmed. That is a truly, terrifying sort of image that you projected for us, or at least for me. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that realistic? Is that something that is going to, again, maybe not maliciously be intended by companies, but a sort of happy accident of using these AI systems?
I do think so. I think that like it has been, hi Nikki. I think it has been functioning that way. And there are actual there are diagrams where thinkers will point out how if functions get too complicated, you can just put them in a black box, and just deal with the input and output. And essentially, that's very much like what I mean, it's a quality of computer programming in general. Like we black box a lot of things, but something like a convolutional neural net is that times like a bunch, times a lot, and nobody knows what's going on inside. Like least of all the people who initially built the net, because it's rearranged itself in accordance with the data it's been fed. So who could know? Nobody. I mean, it's not our job to know. So, and we've seen these kinds of disclaimers pop up in lots of different places, you know, like when a Google search algorithm surfaces something racist in response to a query, oh, you know, awful that that happened, but again, it's the algorithm. So, you know, so I do think like it's a kind of a useful way to think about it.
Yeah, yeah, that the example of the top search, you know, being super bad on Google,
Right.
is another one that, yeah, I instantly thought of, because Google can then say, well, it's just the algorithm, which is responding to what people are doing to game the algorithm. We, you know, didn't put it there. The algorithm did, you know, AI, we didn't do it. The AI system, you know, chose that company, chose that supplier, right? That's a
Yeah.
very interesting, you know, future of supplier responsibility reports, is that, you know, here's our AI system and it picked these suppliers, and, you know, that's what it did. We don't know why it picked them necessarily, but, you know, our programmers assure us that the AI system is, you know, it has this input and, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating to me too about that like case where the company or that company that'll use AI to analyze your own supply chain is like, well, then it becomes a question of probability. Like, well, there's a 20% chance that forced labor was used in the supply chain. And once you are able to quantify it in that way, you can hedge it and, you know, play a game of risk. Like, how likely is it that this will be uncovered and how much would we have to pay? And so it really becomes just another element within the system of risk and liability.
Yeah, it also, yeah, it also makes us maybe wonder about, you know, what is, you know, the future of sort of auditing practice going to look like in a decade or in 2 decades as AI systems, you know, I mean, audits are not necessarily a great mechanism for, you know, identifying problems, but at least they are really conducted, you know, hopefully there are
Yeah,
real people visiting,
that's true.
you know, do we need fewer audits if AI systems are able to sort of interpret from, you know, a smaller data set, which means more potential interpretation rather than sort of real on the ground? Again, the, you know, severe limitations of auditing, but it is boots on the ground, I suppose, at least in some sense, you know, people physically walking into factories. Maybe those factories know months in advance that that person is coming, but, you know, et cetera, et cetera. That's yeah, an implication that um yeah, I had not thought of until you started talking about this. Are there any final questions, thoughts, comments that people have?
Poems, limericks.
Yeah, I guess I could ask the, you know, the big ticket question here, which is, for you, what does a more just supply chain look like from your perspective and your work?
Oh, that is the big question and the one that like I'm really wrestling with right now. Um, I don't know yet. Ask me like hopefully in a few months and I'll tell you hopefully what other people have told me because I'm having trouble kind of getting outside of the system that I know about. Um, but I will say that like what I have come to do, I think I can't remember the phrase that Ben McKean uses in his book, but it's something like the very clothes on our back are produced by like a system that we know to be unethical. And when you're in that, it's really upsetting, like because it's so intimate and yet you feel like you have no choice to get out of it. So people will respond to that in different ways. And one way that people will do that is like attempt to purify themselves. Like only going to buy things if they have an ethical supply chain and I know like where it was sourced. And that is one thing that people can do. To me, that doesn't seem like the most effective use of your time because it seems like you could spend your whole life trying to verify the accuracy of those claims. And, you know, if the fabric comes from, you know, or if the garment is ethically produced, how do I know where the fabric came from? And then how do I know where the cotton was grown and the polyester was spun? It just seems like that's a lot of time to spend on like one garment and like for one person. So what I what I feel like is probably a better use of my energy is to like invest in exactly those kinds of struggles that Elizabeth was pointing to in her question, those choke points, and in particular, like what the workers who labor at those choke points are telling us about how to move forward. So that is a subtle plug, I guess, for next week's talk.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, plug for next week's talk. Plug if you didn't see in the chat for Elizabeth Schwartz's fundraiser there. So thank you everybody for coming. This was really great. Thank you Miriam for and Thad says recently read the journalist Stuart so it's all happening all the time everywhere, which is resonating with the topics today. Yes.
Oh, I gotta read that.
I completely agree. Yeah.
I
So
haven't-
thank you again, everyone, for coming. Please, attend our last event of this series next Wednesday at 6 p.m. And thank you again, Miriam, for those amazing thoughts.
Thank you, Matt. It's really fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.